In the case of ODS destruction projects, the accounting does rely on a projected leak rate of, of the stockpiles or the banks, but the destruction event itself has already occurred when the credits are claimed. Second, carbon offsets have to be additional, meaning that the greenhouse gas emissions reductions exceed those that would otherwise be required by law, regulation, or some kind of mandate. And they also have to exceed common practice. Next slide, please. Greenhouse gas or carbon offsets have to be permanent. And this is more important for forestry type projects, not ODS destruction, but permanent meaning that the removals cannot be reversed. And when they are reversed, there is a mechanism in place to replace any of these reversed emissions. So, in the instance of a forest project, if there was a forest fire or a pest event, how do we replace the carbon that was stored? For ODS destruction, it's not possible to reverse it because once it's destroyed, it's destroyed. Carbon offsets have to be quantifiable, meaning that they are accurately and conservatively quantified. So you have to be able to measure it relative to some kind of a baseline. And that quantification has to be reliable and replicable, and it has to include uncertainty and leakage. So a third party has to be able to come in and reproduce the calculations of the greenhouse gas emissions that are being claimed. Next slide, please. And finally, greenhouse gas emissions that are going to be used for carbon offsets have to be verifiable. Every carbon offset project is verified by a third party or an auditor. So the data that's being claimed has to be documented in a very transparent way. And in the case of a compliance market like California, these carbon offsets are actually enforceable because one entity is going to be exchanging them for a legal obligation in the state of California. And the agency that is responsible in California is the California Air Resources Board, and the authority for the California Air Resources Board to hold a particular party liable and to take appropriate action if any of the provisions of the regulation are violated. The voluntary carbon market would not have this provision, but other compliance carbon markets would. Next slide, please. So just before we move on, just want to say that, it's the reason it's important that every carbon offset is real, it's additional, it's permanent, quantifiable, verifiable, is because each unit is going to be exchanged with another unit with confidence. So these criteria are the hallmarks of every carbon accounting protocol or methodology, and they are kind of the reasons why the rules and requirements within these protocols are there. So offsets are assets that are transacted, and so the integrity of the asset has to be extremely high, and the mechanisms to ensure that integrity have to be really robust. And registries are part of that system. So what do carbon registries do? ACR, as I mentioned, is one of several registries operating in the California compliance market and in the voluntary market. And market participants can choose which registry they work with. The main function of the registry is to protect the environmental integrity of the offsets. So registries perform 4 functions. We develop and approve rigorous carbon accounting standards. So we write standards and vet them. We oversee the verification process so that we are auditing the auditors, so to speak. The registry reviews and registers greenhouse gas emission reductions projects, and then we issue the serialized offsets. So we also are reviewing each project that comes in. And then we operate the transparent registry system, which serializes each offset so that it can be tracked and retired and not double counted. Participants have accounts, so offsets can move between, one party and another party, and we operate that system, which is sort of like a banking or an exchange system. Next slide, please. This slide shows the project development process, which for a carbon offset project, the first phase, it would be project planning. So in the instance of ODS destruction, the project developer would, map out the project in terms of sourcing the ODS, mapping out the key dates, the costs, the destruction events, the ownership of the carbon offsets once they're issued, et cetera. Second, the project would be publicly listed with a registry. Both voluntary carbon offset projects and compliance market projects are listed with a registry, and certain details about the project are made public. Third, monitoring and reporting of the project is completed. And I'll go through some of what these requirements are in a minute. But there's certain data has to be collected about the destruction event itself, where the ODS is sourced from, calculations are done, and these are submitted to the verifier. So the fourth step is the auditing process. Every single carbon offset project is audited by a third party, and that information is then submitted to the registry. The registry reviews it, and then the credits are issued. And then at that point, they can be, transacted for money between the two parties. Next slide, please. There's a lot of words on this slide, not to get too bogged down. The point is that there are multiple registries or carbon programs, and these are all listed on the left side. I've listed 4, the first one being the California Cap and Trade program, and then 3 other programs. But the point is that there are multiple registries. Each one might have 1 or 2 different carbon accounting protocols related to ODS destruction, and they each might have slightly different eligibility in terms of the materials that are allowed and the geography from which it can be sourced. For example, California's ODS projects that are conducted for that market can only be sourced from the US, and the destruction event must occur in the US. And only, the 6 CFCs and 2 HCFCs that are listed across the top are allowed. Whereas, the American Carbon Registry has 2 different protocols, one for internationally sourced ODS, which is relatively new, and then one specifically for the US that allows a couple different halons that are not allowed in California. So for entities that would develop a project, you want to pay close attention to these slight differences and slightly different monitoring requirements. The process to develop the project will be largely the same that I just described, but there may be slight differences between each program that you would want to pay attention to. These protocols are also updated and they evolve. So, you also need to pay attention to, if as protocols change over time. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, every emission reduction must be above and beyond what would be required by regulation. And this concept is called regulatory additionality, and it's unique to carbon offsets as a finance mechanism. ACR's additionality requirements are intended to ensure that credited offsets exceed the greenhouse gas reductions and removals that would have occurred under current laws and regulations, current industry practices, and without carbon market incentives. So that you're not getting credited for things that would have happened anyway. This concept is especially important for the project type of ODS destruction, because CFCs and HFCs are an area of active regulation. And I've listed a few pertinent regulations, both internationally and that are happening in the United States right now, that impact ODS and HFCs. ODS destruction projects are generally for materials that can no longer be produced or imported, and they're generally from these types of stockpiles or banks that Rick mentioned. And so as more of these compounds are completely phased out, they can become eligible for destruction because the production is banned, but their destruction is not required by law. So you can use the carbon market as an incentive mechanism to prevent the leaking by destroying it. But there is a careful interplay between regulation and the carbon market to ensure that regulatory additionality is always there. And that is the job of the registry, to constantly be kind of monitoring the regulatory environment to make sure that the carbon market incentive mechanism can be as effective as possible. And that shows up in the methodology or protocol rules and requirements. Next slide, please. So some examples of eligibility, I'm taking these straight from the California Compliance Market Protocol as an example. There will be eligibility for the facility where the destruction event occurs, and also eligibility for the materials. So for example, you can have single or multiple events at a single destruction facility. In the United States, a facility would need to have a certain type of permit called a RCRA permit. The facility would need to meet US Clean Air Act and other standards and hold certain types of permits. So these are just example criteria that would need to be met by the destruction facility. Next slide, please. Each program will also have its own eligibility requirements for the type of material that can be destroyed and its source. As I mentioned before, this is using California as an example. If we just look at the refrigerant box on the left, California only allows, those 6 CFCs from the refrigerant category to be destroyed. But then if in the voluntary market, additional HCFCs would be allowed. And these are things, again, that the project developer would pay attention to, but the registry is responsible for writing the rules that allow, different sources from different categories. Next slide, please. These are examples of some of the monitoring requirements. And again, each program will have its own monitoring requirements and templates, but they're actually very similar. So these are some of the things that typically need to be monitored for a carbon offset, ODS destruction carbon offset project. So the point of origin of each of the quantities of gas needs to be monitored. The chain of custody from the point of origin to the point of destruction needs to be tracked. This is typically through shipping documents, serial numbers, and weights of tanks at each transfer point. If foam is being sourced, the building locations and construction dates where the building foam originated. Same thing for appliances, where they were sourced from. Samples of the gases are taken and sent to certain laboratories to understand the composition of the gas that's being destroyed so that you can quantify the greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. And at the destruction event itself is monitored with a CEMS system. There are certificates of destruction that need to be kept, facility permits, certifications of the technicians, et cetera. So these are all things that are typically monitored and reported um, to a registry and to the verifier in order to quantify the greenhouse gas emissions reductions and confirm the eligibility. So when the project developer is planning at the beginning, they will make sure that all of this data can be collected in an organized manner so that an auditor can then look at it and audit the project to the standard that's been written. Next slide, please. So I know today we've been focused mostly on destruction of ODS, but within the carbon market, there are several other HFC mitigation activities that can be incentivized during the time when the material can still be legally produced or imported, because the destruction is mainly limited to like these stockpiles of things that are no longer being produced. So these other activities are HFC reclaim and switching to super low GWP alternatives in refrigeration and foam blowing before that switch is required by law. Next slide, please. In terms of impact, clearly up until now, the California compliance market has been the dominant driver in terms of the carbon market being an incentive for ODS destruction in the US. This data is just from ACR's registry, but I would suspect a similar pattern from other registries. So to date, 9.5 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent have been destroyed through ODS destruction projects since around 2009. Only about 3,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent have been issued using ACR's voluntary market protocol. And that is because, one, that protocol is relatively new, and two, the demand is still very high in the California market, and there's also more price certainty in the California market. In the future, I think this will change just because the voluntary market protocols will likely expand more quickly to include more gases and be able to address more markets outside of the US, even though up until now it's been largely dominated by destruction in the US. In terms of the other HFC mitigation project types for the carbon market, ACR has issued almost 6 million metric tons for these activities. So the voluntary carbon market has been a strong driver for these other HFC mitigation activities in the time before they, they can be allowed as a destruction. Okay, next slide, please. So just to conclude about the carbon market, the California compliance market has been an effective incentive for the destruction of CFC ODS in the US. ACR's methodology for US-based ODS destruction for the voluntary carbon market has not been extensively used yet, even though more compounds are allowed relative to the California compliance protocol. But as I said, I do think that will change as the voluntary carbon market is growing. ACR recently adopted a methodology for destruction of internationally sourced ODS, and another carbon offset registry, the Climate Action Reserve, has also recently adopted one that is specific to Mexico. As more HFCs are phased out, carbon markets can be used to incentivize their destruction once they are fully phased out. But in the interim, the carbon market can also be used to incentivize other important mitigation. Next slide, please. That's it. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Margaret, for your presentation. That's a lot of information.
Yeah, welcome questions. And yeah, the slides will be available for sure. So yeah, of course.
Yes, at the end of the presentations, we'll have time for a Q&A session. All participants be reminded there will be time for questions. Our next presentation will be by Nidia Pavon. She'll be talking to us about the experience of how to develop and apply mechanisms of extended producer responsibility in Colombia. Engineer Pavon, let's wait for the slide to come up. Is a chemical engineer, specialist in integrated environmental management, and with extensive experience in the formulation, design, implementation, and monitoring of projects in the design and implementation of environmental policy and in environmental management in industrial processes and infrastructure projects. Nia currently works as a specialized professional of the Ozone Technical Unit of Colombia, being responsible for the execution of plans, programs, and projects for technological updating and bilateral and multilateral assistance related to substances controlled by the Montreal Protocol. So Nidia, please go ahead. Thank you, Carlos Andres, for introducing me. Good morning to everyone. For Colombia's UTO, Ozone Technical Unit, it's been a great pleasure to have your participation throughout these 3 sessions of this virtual webinar. And today we want to share with you what our experience has been like, especially the development of application of producers' extended responsibility addressed to our topic, that is the environmentally sound management of end-of-life ODSs and HFCs. Let's give it a moment while this loads in the Spanish room, especially. Yeah, give us a minute. We haven't been able to upload it in the Spanish room. It's a little bit heavy, so give us a few seconds. I can share if you want me to. Okay, while we get the presentation showing in the Spanish room, I'm gonna go ahead and start. Oh, there it is. It's coming up. Seems like it's coming up. Okay, in order to talk about our specific experiences in the development application of this principle that we call it producer's extended responsibility addressed to ODS and HFC management at their end of life, we should start by telling you that here in Colombia, it's been key to be able to guide all these activities related to the management of HFCs and ODSs at their end of life in 2 main policies that we have developed nationwide. The first one, next slide, please. The first national policy that we based on was the National Policy for Hazardous Waste Management. This policy was passed in 2005. It is being updated at the moment, and we are preparing an action plan for the 21-2030 period. I shall mention here that this policy includes and takes into account all the stages of the substance life cycle. The main objectives of this policy are five. The first one is to promote the application of the hierarchy in the management of hazardous waste. Second objective is to promote the environmentally sound management of hazardous waste, advancing the growth and strengthening of the infrastructure for the collection and management of hazardous waste, and strengthen the institutional capacity for the comprehensive management of hazardous waste, and then improve the processes of generation access to information, also the education mechanisms and the citizen culture. Next one, please. It's also important then to mention that for the management of HFCs and ODSs at the end of life, we also pay attention to the application of all the established, let's say, provisions to manage electronic and electric equipment and all the waste. We call it RAEE. It was passed in 2017. That includes a period between 2017 and 2032, and it also includes within this policy the RAC equipment, refrigeration and air conditioning equipment. The specific objectives of this policy are four, and they are prevent and minimize the generation of WEEE, waste of electronic and electric equipment, then promote the comprehensive management of WEEE, encourage the use of WEEE in an environmentally sound manner, and promote the full integration and participation of producers, merchandising stakeholders, and end users of these electronic and electric equipment in all the stages of the management. Next one, please. Some important points to highlight. These two provisions or policies guide their actions based on several principles. In the case of the hazard waste policy, we have these principles: prevention, caution, the principle that the polluter pays, the responsibility of the generator in all the stages of waste management, also the extended producer responsibility, access to information and public participation, proximity, fewer cross-border movements of the waste, and then self-sufficiency. In the case of WEEE, we again have the extended producer responsibility, the product life cycle, prevention, sustainable production and consumption, gradualness, active participation, decentralization, and then innovation, science, and technology as guiding principles for this management. Next one. We see that, as we saw before in the previous slide, we found there the extended producer responsibility, EPR. That'll be this presentation and next. So what is the extended producer responsibility, EPR? And we have taken this from the national policy on the comprehensive management of WEEE. It is a duty of the producer. It could be the manufacturer or the importer. That's how we see it in Colombia, of electrical and electronic equipment throughout the different stages of the product life cycle. The extended producer responsibility is an emerging principle in a new generation of product-focused policies. It was first coined in Sweden by in the 90s. In a broad sense, the EPR is a principle by which producers maintain a degree of responsibility for all the environmental impacts of their products throughout their life cycle, from the extraction of raw materials through production and until the final disposal of the product as waste in the post-consumption stage. Next one, please. Now, what's important to highlight here? Okay, so we have looked at EPR, what it is about, that will not only work if we leave it up to producers, but we have to work. I mean, the different stakeholders, all those involved in the chain of the substances and the equipment, we need to work together so that we promote different actions. They are the government, the buyers and sellers, producers, and of course, especially consumers, final consumers. Next, please. Based on the points I've made regarding the regulatory framework, as well as the political framework in Colombia for the management of hazardous waste and also for WEEE, we've been observing an important development on the management of these final products, especially based on EPR, the extended producer responsibility. These programs apply to returnable or products, especially mass consumption products. And of course, we can clearly recognize who the producer was, who put it out in the market in the first place. Also, we look at different materials that have a high potential for recycling or high valuable components, and also they have hazardous waste that are interesting to the environment. So in Colombia, we have implemented, and they are already being implemented, different selective collection systems. Some of them are mandatory, others are in a stage, let's say voluntary or developmental stage. Mandatory, we have them for computers, light bulbs, batteries, used tires. Voluntary, now we have cell phones, and something that we're all interested in because of the common topic at hand is refrigerators and air conditioning equipment. We also have other consumption plans, especially for pesticides, medication or pharmaceutical products, and also used batteries with lead and acids. We're also working on establishing clean points for used kitchen oil, and also in the environmental management plan of waste of we're talking about containers and packaging. Next one, please. This is has to do with something we'll be developing in the next slides, have been the framework of the regulation of the comprehensive management of EEE. I think we need to move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. The regulatory development. So we need to establish resolutions. That was since 2009, 2010, and in July 2013, a new law was passed for the comprehensive management of we. Then in 2017, there was a new policy for we management, and then we've been working on the regulation of that law, specifically for that for waste of electric and electronic equipment management. We have a new project ongoing that will establish the specific requirements and the specific conditions regarding goals for equipment management, as well as the way how it will be qualifying the selective collection systems. One of them will be associated to everything related to refrigeration and air conditioning equipment. Next one, please. Taking into account the information, the political framework, and the policies to manage rack equipment and rack waste, and also based on the successful experience to work with the refrigeration sector, in the domestic refrigeration sector, and all the projects that have been implemented by or with the support from the Montreal Protocol. One of the demonstrative projects that was financed by the multilateral fund that Rick mentioned in his presentation at the beginning, hand in hand with the program from of the United Nations Development Program and the Colombian Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development, UTO, the Zone Technical Unit. We invited the Colombian Association of Business Owners, ANDI, and the companies of the domestic refrigeration sector to work together and implement a selective collection system by minimum environmentally sound management of we started with domestic refrigerators and it's been extended. The scope has been extended to other types of equipment, for example, rack and especially air conditioning. At this moment, this selective collection that we call it Red Network, sorry, Green Network, Red Verde in Spanish, Green Network, and there are five brands that started to work with this program in 2014, and they have some allies that are also in the process of joining the program. Right now, this Red Verde or Green Network represents about 80 or 85% of participation in the domestic refrigeration sector. And the idea is to implement all the mandates that have been established by law in the regulation and within the framework of, again, PR, Standard Producer Responsibility. So what does this environmental sound management and selective collection system do? Next one, please. How does Red Verde operate? First, there's an application registration. They receive the units in a given point, or they facilitate the collection, and then they uh, manage them properly in an environmental sound manner. Especially air conditioning and refrigerators, they identify them, they weigh them, they extract the critical material, they store it, they have the identification and weighing, critical material extraction, reuse, treatment, and or final disposal. And so we have the all the traceability of the materials. Next one. How are they managed at the end of the useful life? At the moment, we supported by this system that applies precisely to the extended producer responsibility. We carry out the extraction of the refrigerant gas. There are indications or instructions how to dispose of them, either through use or it could be through treatment for the final disposal. So there's disassembled separation of the different fractions to be used, and we separate the hazardous waste, and then we use the different alternatives for the final disposal and environmental sound management. Next one. Taking into account the progress we have achieved hand in hand with the productive sector and with the support of United Nations Development Program, within the framework of these projects, also financed by the Montreal Protocol, we have taken into account other policies and national strategies that have allowed us to start thinking or start to think that we are still in initial stage as to how we should guide the environmentally sound management of HFCs and ODSs. And we have taken into account the National Program for the Rational and Efficient Use of Energy. And here there's an initiative to replace refrigerators and air conditioning units. We also have taken into account the National Climate Change Policy. It also includes actions to low carbon and in the area of low carbon and climate resilient development regarding HFCs, and also the National Circular Economy Strategy. It was formulated in our country in 2019, and it also includes activities related to the management of our AC equipment and how to use the materials. Next one. Then we can start thinking that we must bring different initiatives together. We must also think of synergies for the environmental sound management of end-of-life ODS and HFCs. This is why we have been working hand in hand with the different stakeholders. And right now we have two projects that are being implemented, and the idea is to support the replacement of equipment and the environmental sound management of the equipment and substance. Specifically, there's a campaign that intends to help people replace their domestic refrigerators. There's a financial incentive, specifically in the taxation. to reduce the VAT from 19% to 5%, especially for families of low income families. We call them SEL, social economic level. SEL, social economic level. So families with low SEL, everyone has to pay VAT. But when there are certain requirements, the users can enjoy an advantage in the reduction of the VAT. So this strategy to replace the refrigerators was welcomed by a big project that was also having the framework of climate change issues. This is a NAMA for the domestic refrigeration sector in Colombia. It also includes the fact of promoting the replacement of domestic refrigeration apparatuses in Colombia, also to promote the environmental sound management of ODSs found in that equipment. And then next one, I think this is all about my presentation. As a conclusion, I'd like to mention, as Rick mentioned in the introducing presentation, is not one single mechanism to contribute to financing, one single financial mechanism to manage ODSs at the end of life, but the idea is to have a combination of different mechanisms, or better, to be able to establish synergies amongst different financing sources. In our case, they all started once we explored and looked for after collective work and implementing or seeking to implement the responsibilities in the framework of this principle of the producers, the extended producer responsibility. And we have made progress to have the environmental sound management of substances and equipment. We still need to explore more and assess other options. I believe something Margaret that presented during her talk that was very interesting as one of the topics that with certainly from Colombia will be assessing and looking into. Okay, that's all about my presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm willing to answer questions at the end of the session. Thank you, Nidia, for your presentation. Thank you, everyone. The next presentation will be by Pablo Prieto, Director of Maves Corporate Businesses. Nidia presented part of the EPR program, Extended Producer's Responsibility. We're going to be looking at this from a different angle, from the producer side. So we have with us today Pablo Moreno. Pablo has served as president of the Association for Standardization and Certification, ANC, in Mexico. Also, the National Association of Manufacturers of Household Appliances, ANFAD, and the National Chamber of Electrical Manufacturers. He currently chairs the Council of the Trust for the Savings of the Electric Power in Mexico. Throughout his professional career, he has served as Director of Institutional Relations at Vitro and as Director of Public Relations and Communication at Prodigy MSN. He is currently Head of Corporate Affairs at Mave. So, Pablo, please go ahead. Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank your kind invitation to participate in today's webinar to share the experiences that Mavi has lived in implementing the EPR program, Extended Producers Responsibility Program. And I'd like to share it with you the view, the approach, and the lessons learned that we've been able to harvest throughout this time. So if you allow me, please move on to the next slide. Okay, for starters, I'd like to share with you that we at Mavi, we see sustainability as a roadmap to find balance, a new balance, and we have been consolidating this through the implementation of our corporate uh, model. As you can see on the screen, is our corporate sustainability model. We want to impact three aspects of sustainability. First, the economy, society, and the environment. Always seeking to improve the development or no, the performance of our company and enhancing innovation while adding value to our products. Next one, please. Throughout this corporate model, we have developed a strategic route. It's formed by 23 action lines, amongst which the EPR is considered in this action line number 12 that we call use of materials. And why have we wanted to include the producer's extended responsibility or PR? Or because we see that this is articulated key to consolidate a new way of doing businesses. Next one, please. To start talking about experience in implementing this approach of PR or producer's extended responsibility, we need like to start with this definition. Nidia has already mentioned this. I just want to remind ourselves that PER has been designed as an environmentally sound policy where we want to adopt actions that ensure the right management of products. Products that have been placed in the market and they have come to their end of life. Here we show the definition of the OECD as Nidia put it before in her presentation. I just want to mention the words responsibility is an extended policy. It's not exclusive and it's been designed to respond to the product life cycle. Please move on to the next one. The EPR approach, I'm sorry, PER approach has been developed in an important manner and it's been at a big pace, a fast pace, especially in Latin America. Right now, there are at least 7 countries developing at different levels of maturity, developing these provisions, and they've been adopting this approach throughout the last few years. This graph shows some sort of regional status, and we can see the countries that are in the beginning stage, and they have regulatory policies to be built or developed. Those are in yellow. They are Argentina and Guatemala. We can also see those countries where there's another stage. They are building the regulation. That's orange. That's Ecuador and Chile. And a third block of countries where this principle of PER is already operative. That's the case of Colombia, as Nidia has expressed. And then finally, countries such as Peru, that is green, green color, where this is in the operation stage. It's a mandatory view, and there are policies and instruments. So what are we negotiating as Mavi, an industry, and as a sector in each one of these stages? Well, to begin with, we're promoting the co-responsibility of all stakeholders and interested parties. That's something Ni also mentioned. The responsibility is extended to the producer, but it's not exclusive to producers. This means that to be able to achieve the goals we're visualizing, I'm talking about the goals from the perspective of consolidating and tuning and causing a change in the way we produce and consume. We need a partnership between the governments, producers, consumers, and the managing companies, of course. If we consolidate all this through a graduality principle that we'll be describing later, will allow us to walk towards environmentally sound management of these waste of WEEE, waste of electronic and electric equipment, and ensure traceability of the practice so that we can internalize the costs at companies. And at the same time, we can generate and consolidate this type of work, again, together with governments and all other stakeholders. This is all uh, under a regional harmonization of regulations. Next one, please. More specifically, we'd like to share with you the experience we have lived in Colombia through creating Red Verde, the green network, which Nina has already introduced, and she's explained the context. And well, it's an organization through Mavi, together with other producing companies. We've created this network to respond to PER and then develop activities after consumption activities to recover and manage the products in an environmentally sound manner. This initiative started in 2014 with Mavi was a founder partner together with other companies in the sector and with the technical support of the Colombia's Ozone Technical Office. And it's been a very interesting journey. And from my viewpoint, it's been very successful. From the beginning, the idea is to create the collection system. It's the creation of a system for the collection and environmental management of household appliances. Also, communication strategies of mechanisms for recovery of WEEE. But we've also carried out environmental education activities. If we can move to the next slide. We have wanted to strengthen the capabilities for the management of ODSs and HFCs, and what we call the phase out of refrigerant gases. We have also strengthened the development of capabilities to treat waste, parts and components that are found, and also the creation of regeneration, reclaim of refrigerant gases, where they can be reclaimed and go through purification processes so that they may be integrated back into the commercial activities, some commercial activities. We have also worked on strengthening capacities with environmental managers so that we can ensure the recovery of refrigerant gases and the right management of the um, devices. Finally, we have worked in close cooperation with governments to drive other refrigerator replacement programs. An example is this called Deliver It Now, something that we've driven and supported from Green Network, Red Verde, with the support of the government. Now, on the right-hand side, and speaking about the beginning of Red Verde, since it was created again in 2014, we've been able to manage a total of 19,451 uh, devices. They are equivalent to 812 no, 712 tons. And we have also managed for over 14,000 parts that may be reassessed. So we need to, we have avoided the improper management of over 1,135 devices. This is another important point that even though the big efforts that we have carried out have been successful to a certain point, one of the main challenges we still face is the consolidation of the recovery of the devices that are in the homes. And here we have just, let's say, captured less than 1% of products that are placed out in the market each year. And we have been able to see and realize that today in Latin America, the collection goals were established in a mandatory manner from governments. For example, in the case of Peru, without going over a graduality phase, of course, we would be losing the true potential there is for recycling or recovery. Next one, please. What have we learned so far? Our lessons learned. First, I'd like to say that incorporating PR programs, this should be an element adopted as a company's business model. There's not any other way to do this because at the moment we're facing very important challenges where we can see the PR as an opportunity to close the loop and then to introduce them back into productive chains after reclaiming and develop capacities for other contexts. We also see the value of the standard harmonization for the region. PR is a practice that we need to approach not just locally, and that's an important point, but regionally. To be able to establish the homogeneous base of capabilities and then close the loops and then ensure the proper management of these waste and then avoid the consequences because it could be a potential leak of devices that are not properly regulated. Another lesson learned is the importance of capacity building for the management of ODSs and HFCs, again at the regional level. This is another element that is also key to ensure the proper management and then avoid the impact on the environment as well as the impact on climate change because of inappropriate management of these kind of substances. I'd also like to say that it's important to develop actions and strategies to bring changes to populations' consumption patterns. That's probably one of the biggest challenges we have to face. One of the main challenges we have to overcome is how to ensure that the final user returns the device, especially final consumer. This is one of the elements that has become key, and the break-even point probably to what a successful project would mean, because it would be a virtuous circle of the PR. Another lesson learned is the next bullet. We said that PR program is the extended plus non-exclusive. I think it means that it's extended but not exclusive. This means that to be successful to implement this regulation, is important to bring efforts together from different parties, because it's not something that may be sorted out from by a single stakeholder and only the producer. I think Nidia explained that clearly. It takes articulation of all different stakeholders, the government, producers, sales force, everyone, to be able to make this change in consumption patterns amongst the population. Also, we need to continue to encourage the cooperative work with ozone technical units in the different countries and with international cooperation bodies so that we may contribute to the harmonization of the regulation and regionalize this practice. And then we can develop capabilities in a homogeneous manner to face the future challenges. And then we can have more knowledge exchange with international cooperation. We know that in other regions in the world, for example, in Europe, this approach has been there for several years, and there have been more lessons learned, many things they've been able to harvest. That's why it's so important that we establish a sequence or a sequence of programs better to have knowledge transfer in the end so that the Latin American region, we can maybe speed up our progress there and implement this regulation. Next one, please. Here we refer to the term called graduality, and from Avi's perspective, I shall say that big challenge to consolidate the practice of a PER is found in the principle of graduality. There's no doubt about this, as the main axis for its application and consolidation. What do we mean by this? It's clear that practice in consumption in Latin America is very diverse, it's very different. There are different challenges as well. This is why, to this day, if governments consolidate the relations, moving directly to establishing goals for product recovery without taking the concept of graduality in mind, then we will not be able to encourage the principle that we're trying to apply, that is to consolidate the right recovery of products and the closing of the loop. This is why we want to move on through the three or go through the three stages to make it gradual, all under PER. The first stage that we talk about is diagnosis. That will allow know about the current status, current condition of each region or country. For example, statistics, the number of products possibly to be recovered. Also, the regulation, the installed capacity, the infrastructure that is present, everything related to this. Based on that, after that diagnosis, we can move on to the next stage, which is to develop or build capacities. And then to finish building the regulation and all the awareness that we need for the third stage, that is the consolidation of results. So graduality is not something that may take place overnight because it implies the development of different capacities in different flanks. That's why we need to observe what that PR today represents a, say, a changing element in our circular economy to ensure the competitiveness of all stakeholders. And we need to look at this from this angle because we can go beyond conceiving this as just as a regulatory policy. And today we face a big challenge to maximize the way how we use our resources, right? And that's why PR is a key element. It's just a starting point to close the circle. Production, and then all these concepts that we have mentioned, they ensure the sustainability of our productive chains. So we need to begin to see our products as the potential raw materials of tomorrow. That's the key there. And also, it's important to consider that the PR is a trigger to move into production stage and recover materials, and then we will be able to consolidate the circular economy approach, or we can apply the circular economy concept. We know that because of the pandemic, we have noticed the importance, how important it is to have supply or ensure supply in all productive chains, and also to see how we can close loops internally. As a conclusion, if we don't do PR gradually, it'll be more difficult to implement other elements or to move to circular economy. So we should not lose focus that this network is the seed and then we will be able to close those cycles and create a change, bring a change in the way we do businesses. So to conclude, the next slide, please. So again, we restate our responsibility in PR, or a commitment to PR better, and we know it's a tool for future context. We at Mavi, we see this goes beyond complying with some piece of regulation. This is why it's so important for us to walk this path under this principle of graduality, capacity development, and harmonization with the region, and changes in consumption patterns as a source of circular economy. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pablo, for your presentation and the way Mavi is approaching PR. Our next presentation is like we've been throughout America today. We've been to Canada, California, Mexico, Colombia, and now we're going to Brazil. The next presentation will be given by Sueli Carval and Vitar Ribeiro. They'll be telling us about uh, sustainable projects of HFC and ODS management, their end of life. A case study in Brazil. Dr. Carvalho is a physicist with a PhD from Purdue University, US, with over 35-year experience in climate and zone layer protection, assisting developing countries to protect the environment, fostering capacity building, and the implementation of effective and accountable programs. Former Director of Technology Transfer at the Sao Paulo State Environment Protection Agency, Brazil, and Director of the Montreal Protocol and Chemicals Unit at UNDP in New York. Currently, Dr. Caval is a senior expert member of the UNEP Technology and Economic Assessment Panel for the Montreal Protocol. Also, TEAP and senior technical advisor of on ozone and climate policies and programs at the Institute of Climate and Society in Brazil. Now, Vital Ribeiro is an architect with a master's in health management and the environment from the Business School of Antilio Vargas in Sao Paulo. With 35 years of experience in environmental health, developing programs and sustainable healthcare, Mr. Ribeiro works at the Center for Health Surveillance, Department of Public Health of Sao Paulo State Government since 1987. He's a member of the organization Healthcare Without Harm, HCWH, the coordinator of the Global Green and Healthy Hospitals Network in Brazil, and the president of the board of the Brazilian NGO called Healthy Hospitals Projects. No further ado, Sueli, you have the floor for your presentation. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all attending this webinar session. I'm Sueli Carvalho and would like, on behalf of my colleague Vital, to thank the government of Colombia, US EPA, and UNDP for the invitation. Next, please. Next slide, please. I'm Senior Advisor of the Institute and Climate Society, which is a philanthropic organization that coordinates the Kigali project in Brazil that's funded by the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, KCEP. The goal of this project is to foster energy efficiency policy and bring the market transformation for low carbon products, specifically in the air conditioning sector in Brazil. The Institute works with a team of experts and many partners. One of them is with us today. That's Mr. Vital Ribeiro from the Healthy Hospitals Project, which is dedicated to transform the health sector and promote awareness and actions towards more environmentally friendly healthcare operations. Next slide, please. Well, before we look into mapping or work managing ODS and HFC banks, we need to actually access and collect them, preferable in quantities large enough to be of interest and economically viable. We structured this presentation to show the opportunity of using bulk procurement practice through Buyers Club to make feasible ODS and HFC collection and then end-of-life necessary actions. I will show the steps used, including the selection of key partners and sectors that enabled us to reach large-scale replacement of air conditioning equipment, which are inefficient and use high GWP greenhouse refrigerant gases. The approach we use uses energy efficiency as entry point, as well as the corporate social and environmental responsibility and sustainability commitment of a selected large buyer. After my presentation, I will then give the floor to Mr. Vidal, who will present our pilot project in the health sector. Next, please. It's important to show that when we started the Kigali project in Brazil, many actions were needed before we even thought about pushing for high efficiency products in the market. For instance, there were no, the minimum energy efficiency performance standards and labeling were outdated. High efficiency air conditioning units with lower GWP fluid was not manufactured in Brazil, nor existed in the local market. No awareness program existed to educate the consumer to select better products. And Brazil was at a very early stage of the Kigali Amendment ratification. But a lot of progress has been made with the help of the KSEP project. We have done revisions on the outdated standards of energy efficiency labels. And now we can send a signal to the manufacturers to invest in energy efficiency. Starting this month, there is production of higher energy efficiency air conditioning products with lower GWP fluid in Brazil. Also, large civil society network was created in partnership with the Consumer Defense Institute, generating very successful media campaigns. So to educate the consumer to purchase more environmentally friendly equipment. And Kigali ratification is about to be approved by the Congress. Next slide, please. As mentioned in this presentation before, we intend to show the opportunity of using Buyers Club to make feasible ODS and HFC collection and end-of-life actions. Not many of us are usually used with the term Buyers Club. We call it Clube de Compras in Portuguese. It's an organization or a group that works towards increasing the benefits of purchasing in large quantity, bringing the price down, as well as better quality of a specific product. In summary, club members are buyers with large purchase power, such as a big retail store chain, which uses air conditioning equipment in its store and offices. Or in our case, the hospitals that we're going to present. And then these large buyers, then we're able to pull the demand for this specific product, in the case air conditioners, and then negotiate a better price with the manufacturers. Next slide, please. And And then who are our main players in this scheme? In the supply chain, we have the air conditioner manufacturers. Using higher energy efficiency of the project as an entry point, we can also negotiate in the package a lower GWP fluid, proper spare parts, training, and installation. In the demand side, we focus on large buyers and pull the demand for AC units needed to negotiate the lower price. So you wonder how the sound management of end-of-life ODS and HFCs come in the scenario. Those large equipment replacement programs will bring a control of a collection of a significant large quantities of ODS and HFCs. And of course, the corporate responsibility that the buyers in their companies as an entry point will help us to discuss with the purchase departments the introduction of sustainable purchase programs that are to be introduced in their corporate policies. Not necessarily all the corporate responsibility programs of a big company is dealing with, for instance, purchase of air conditioning with the low GWP fluid that we want. Next slide, please. Well, we in what we call the diagnosis or the market assessment, we went through 3 steps to put in place this replacement program. The first was the market assessment. Our partner teams surveyed the room air conditioning markets, but also requested information on other cooling equipment such as chillers. We also looked at the refrigeration equipment used, even though in this presentation, we're going to focus on the air conditioning data only. Next slide, please. The second step was about technical and economic viability of the equipment replacement program. In order to do that, we had numerous meetings with manufacturers and industry associations. We have also looked at finance needs to make replacement programs viable and sustainable. We also did a broad assessment of Brazilian public programs and regulations that support energy efficiency actions, such as the utility obligation law that we have, which generates a substantial amount of funding, which can be used for selected energy efficiency projects. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. The third step was the mapping of the opportunities from the sector assessments. So looking at the health sector on top left, we found that Brazil has over 2,900 public and 4,300 private health institutions with 445,000 patient rooms with split end refrigerators installed and central cooling units using R22, R410A, and R134A. The second line, the big bank line, is the finance sector with over 21,000 bank agencies, mostly with central cooling system. The pandemic accelerated the shift to smaller bank branches, promoting the demand for more split units with R22 and R410A. There are other sectors and other opportunities, as you can see in the slide, but we're not going to be addressing them due to time constraint. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we have some initial sectors that we selected for pilot projects after the mapping. The finance sector, like working with the banks. We met at the Brazilian Bank Association, several banks, and selected Santander Bank and one of its largest clients, a large retail store in Brazil called Magazine Luiza, or Magalu, They have over 3,000 stores in Brazil and growing. Santander is, like I said, as Magazine Luiza is Santander's client, and of course they're going to discuss finance through Santander Bank for their regular replacement programs that they have. We have also engaged the purchase power of the state government of São Paulo and succeeded to introduce new criteria for statewide public procurement and educated their purchase divisions to purchase new high efficiency air conditioning units instead of still available but inefficient R22 ones. And last but not least, the health sector, where we partner with the Healthy Hospitals NGO, MidCity, a technical company specialized in energy, and Citaui, that's a sustainable finance company that will help us to do the business dialogue with our partners and also with the business model. This pilot assessed 33 hospitals and their purchase power, and we are now working on an action plan. Next slide, please. The health sector pilot team has finalized its assessment last April, and now we have the inventory of all cooling appliances in this 33 hospital sample. We are now detailing the technical part, the financial model, and then looking at ODS and HFC end-of-life solutions. Implementation is expected to start in 2022. I would like now to give the floor to my colleague Vital to present the pilot project in the health sector. Next slide, please. Vital, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sueli. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity for presenting this case study from Brazil. PHS work with healthcare organizations since 2010, and now we have 231 members. These members are hospitals and other health facilities, and 14 health systems representing about 1,000 other healthcare facilities. PHS Health Hospitals project have 4 main campaigns, which we call green challenges. These 4 challenges are climate, energy, sustainable procurement, and waste management. Each challenge implies a commitment to environmental performance goals and measuring, managing, and reporting results towards those goals. The end-of-life ODS and HFC management is related to all these 4 challenges, but they are more directly addressed by the energy challenge, which went into full operation at the end of 2020. We started with 47 facilities and 33 of which completed the entire process. This is an excellent mark since the process is very demanding in collecting detailed information like energy management, internal policies, energy bills, fossil fuel consumption, in situ generation, lighting, etc. Detailed HVAC infrastructure specification was very stressed in this challenge. So let's look at some findings from the analyzed data. Next, please. As we can see in this graphic, the first cohort already had a strong commitment to sustainability, and 80% of them had energy efficient institutionalized in their policies. Next, please. This shows the total number of split and window AC equipments and the type of refrigerants used. HCFCs are used in 56% of the equipments, and HFCs below 750 GWP are in 39%. And surprisingly, the data shows a small amount of low GWP and zero ODP, perhaps due to misidentification. Next. Next slide, please. Okay. About 40% of equipments, now including splits and central AC systems, is less than 4 years old, but almost 20% is more than 9 years old, indicating great potential for replacement in short term. There is an even higher potential for replacement of refrigeration equipment, like refrigerators, freezers, and cool rooms used in hospitals, which are over 9 years old of use. Next, please. Okay. Here we see the results of applying a financial model on the replacement of equipment in the sample of the hospitals. The exchange of chillers had the best results in energy and financial savings, which result in a very attractive payback of around 2.3 years. It's really a very good opportunity. And replacing room AC units are also attractive, especially as it involves smaller investments and it's more easily implemented. We believe that this demonstrates that energy efficient can be an entry point for refrigerant replacement, accelerating the penetration of more environmental technology in the market. Next. As presented by Sueli, Purchase Club can favor end-of-life solution for refrigerants. Based on this, we estimate the amount of refrigerants that could be taken out of use in more controlled conditions through an extensive program. Considering the number of mini splits in the hospitals that participate in the research and the amount of refrigerant in each equipment, the total amount of the gases reach 1.4 tons of R410A and more than 2 tons of R22. This represents 4.6 million of CO2 metric tons avoided. And only from this 33 hospitals. Extrapolating this estimation to the entire national level health system, we got a total stock of 9,000 tons of R410A and 13,000 tons of R22 being used by about 6,000 hospitals in Brazil. So as we can see, there's a huge potential for reduction CO2 emissions on this. Next. Considering the useful life of existing equipments and the availability of new refrigerant in the national market, a proposal end-of-life schedule was devised in order to analyze the refrigerant retirement potential along the time. Next, please. So these are some highlights, some key points and challenges to be considered in refrigerant end-of-life implementation in Brazil. And we see there is a diversity of aspects that we are addressing, and for the transition to occur faster and effectively. Next. So this is our contribution to the diagnosis of the situation in Brazil. And as a conclusion, we are confident that the significant savings resulting from greater energy efficiency associated with increasing commitment to environmental responsibility among healthcare organizations in Brazil offer favorable conditions for refrigerant replacement programs, and that Buyers Club would be the most suitable approach to ensure the best solution for of refrigerants end of life in Brazil. So that's it, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sueli and Vital, for your presentation. It gives us an idea of what is taking place in the field to close the for the end-of-life management of ODSs. Our next presentation by Mark Miller from Canada. He'll be talking to us about the management of ODSs and HFCs at their end of life. It's a case study in Canada. Mark Miller has been active within the Montreal Protocol community for nearly 30 years. He was instrumental in coordinating a provincial government in Canada plan to address ozone-depleting substances and halocarbons, including the initial regulatory framework and certification training plan for industry and government. He has attended Montreal Protocol meetings, hosted MP side events, been a valuable resource for NGOs, UNEP, DTIE, and other stakeholders through the journey to safeguard our ozone layer and climate systems. Mark was a participant on a World Bank mission to China phasing out halons and hosted NOU representatives on capacity building study tours to Manitoba, Canada. Mark, you may go ahead with your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And good morning from Canada, everyone. My greetings to you. A huge thank you for UNDP, to Rick Cook, Karina, and all those involved in Colombia and behind the scenes to make this happen. I think this webinar is highly successful, has shared information that will move the progress forward on the Montreal Protocol regime. Next slide, please. I just wanted to give you a bit of a purview of where we're located. I'm speaking from you in the center of Canada in Manitoba. As you can see on the map here, it's about 2 times the size of Colombia. We have a population of 1.2 million people. We have in our dynamics here are a little bit unique to the world. We have a hybrid socialist capitalist government here. So the dynamics are a little bit different that allows us to maybe do things uniquely to the world, and I think highly aggressive to address climate change and of course ozone depletion through the Montreal Protocol. We have seen in our jurisdiction, of course, climate change very specifically to our Inuit populations, as well as to polar bears in the northern area of Hudson Bay, you can see. So I think the impact of climate change has hit Manitoba and our jurisdiction more significantly than maybe some parts of the world. And so we've moved things forward. We produce here, we have a mint that produces money for many countries throughout the world. pharmaceutical industry, buses we produce, and so forth. So we're highly industrialized, and we are also highly regulated. And so we take that approach for many things. Our electricity is all hydro. We have no nuclear, coal, or any other regime, which makes us highly in a good position to address climate change. And believe it or not, our energy is the cheapest in all of North America at about 8 cents per kilowatt hour. That is highly unusual, but very, very positive for us. In terms of the next slide, please. My presentation will give you a little bit of dynamics of what MOPIA is, who I work for, the stakeholder industry participation, how that's come about, partnership with government, programs and services, certification training that we provide, stewardship, and of course that's the focus is EPR and end-of-life stewardship of refrigerants and other products. I'll start with this. MOPIA is a not-for-profit organization. We are not government funded. We do not receive funds from our government. And so that is a unique characteristic that we would love to show developing nations, highly industrialized developing nations, that can work effectively to implement not only the ozone regime, but the climate change activities as well. We have a volunteer board of directors composed of people from the various industry sectors. And we have a government regulation in our province. Manitoba is one of 10 provinces in Canada. Our province has allowed MOPIA, this not-for-profit organization, to in fact operate at arm's length to the government, but at the same time provide insight, regulatory advice, guidance to the minister directly, and so forth. And again, at no cost to the government. The enforcement of the regulation, though, specifically is through environment officers that work for the government. So we liaise with the government on this and the industry stakeholders. So if there is non-compliance or if there's issues in terms of end-of-life stewardship, we can advise the government of approach going forward. Next slide, please. This just shows our staff complement. We began in 1994, again, out of a group of volunteers from the various air conditioning or rack sectors. But it went beyond that, in fact. It went into the halon sectors, the foam sectors, methyl bromide, and even hospital sterilants. Next slide, please. You can see here that we do, in fact, have a diverse group of stakeholders who came to address this issue. Manitoba, our organization and the government was the first to propose the phase out of hospital sterilants, and all of Canada echoed that approach to mitigate the impact of sterilants going forward in the medical facilities, as well as halons. We had strict control on halons going forward, and I'll talk a little bit about the stewardship of that in the next little bit. But you know, the first priority for any government, developing nation or developed, is to determine whether it's going to be a volunteer or regulatory approach. We've seen, of course, in some instances that a voluntary approach does work and can work, but you have to have, of course, buy-in by all of the industry partners. This isn't always possible. For instance, in our province, all of our white goods, all of our appliances, and most other equipment in the air conditioning sector comes from abroad. So we cannot really regulate the producers of these products very effectively. So we have to use a regulatory approach to ensure that they have end-of-life stewardship of products. And you'll see more of that as we go forward. Second priority, of course, and I think Nydia and others have talked about this, is a priority of how to implement this, whether again it's a voluntary approach or if you're going to use regulatory instruments to encourage the participation or actually the mandate of these organizations. You have to have buy-in and support from the industry sectors, of course. If there's resistance, if there's political pushback or other negative connotations to a program, of course, things will not go smoothly. And we've seen this, whether it be in hazardous waste at some time or other products that are at end of life that we've talked about here, you can have significant resistance and complications, and even the public, if there's mixed signals, will not buy into the stewardship of the program. And of course, fifth is the end of life ODS stewardship, HFC stewardship, and that's so critical, as we'll talk about. Next slide, please. Just to give you a bit of a background, this all came together, of course, back in 1987 with the Montreal Protocol and so forth, but we were really the first to implement an Ozone Depleting Substances Act and regulation in Manitoba, which gave us the pathway forward to make sure that not only the consumers, but the industry was going to buy into addressing ozone depleting substances and climate change gases. And beyond that, it just gives you a bit of a timeline that we had some amendments to the legislation. As the Montreal Protocol evolved, so did, of course, emerging products. And so we had to address those that weren't first captured back in 1990 and so forth. Even today with the Kigali Amendment, Manitoba and the rest of Canada has to adjust the regulatory approach to ensure that there is stewardship of existing ODSs and HFCs, and we plan to do that in the short-term future here. Next slide, please. Sort of in terms of tight controls, I wanted to talk to you about that. Regulations really require a number of aspects, and all persons in our province purchasing and servicing equipment containing regulated substances, refrigerants in this case, must be certified, must, no question, have training that they're competent to recover this refrigerant and ensure that it isn't released. We've trained over 18,000 people in our province alone, and you know this, they call it the stick. The stick is there's penalties under the regulation for non-compliance, and on a first offense, believe it or not, they're up to $40,000 for non-compliance, in addition to 6 months in prison. So you can be assured that people are cognizant of that and aware of that, and do not want to be fined. In a kind of a comparison, Manitoba, you may have heard on the news, we are the hotspot in all of North America for COVID-19, unfortunately. And so we've had tight controls here, lockdowns and a whole variety of things. But I share that with you because the fines for non-compliance for COVID are about $1,300 versus what you see here, 50,000 Canadian dollars for the ODS sectors. We also require in Manitoba all companies that purchase regulated products, new and used, and including refrigerants, have to have a permit. So MOPIA, the government of Manitoba, can very much track what company is purchasing and importing products into our province, and those are all as I say, documented, and can only be in the hands of those who legitimately should have those products. So that allows good tracking, good tracing for end-of-life stewardship as well, because we know where all products are, from chillers to stockpiles of refrigerant. We have tight controls, as I say, because look, we also have all leaks over 10 kilograms must be reported to an environment officer immediately. So if there's instances of that, we know in a given time period how much refrigerant has been leaked intentionally or unintentionally, and so that's very, very important as well. All refrigerant use in our province has to be recorded and submitted to us once a year. Every ounce of refrigerant in Manitoba in every air conditioning system must be recorded. And so again, we know not only the type, but the amount of refrigerant, and we associate that with the climate change risk as well. So we can well document that. And this is an important point. Sellers of refrigerant in our province, all wholesalers and any corporate enterprise, must accept back refrigerant from purchasers, from anybody who has purchased it from them, whether it be contaminated or surplus, and they're responsible for its disposal. So that's very critical to know, and a very important regulatory point, I think. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please.
Just a second, Mark, please.
Sure. Excellent. Thank you. So the certification training that we provided to all of our technicians includes, of course, environmental awareness, ozone and climate change information, regulatory awareness, and proper recovery and record keeping, in addition to allowing them to know what is the proper stewardship, what is the proper end-of-life plans or opportunities that they have for products. So everyone in the sectors, all the HVAC or rack sectors, will know what their options are to basically mitigate the impact of the release of refrigerants and so forth. We also have online correspondence and self-study classroom training too. Next slide, please. In the next slide, I'm going to just quickly mention that natural refrigerants training is something that is, of course, not new, but has been highly uptaken in Europe. And we have a new partnership with an Italian organization as well as the UK Institute of Refrigeration. And if any of you have been at Montreal Protocol meetings, you know, of course, that this is something that is gaining momentum. Marco Bueno from the Institute in Italy has embraced MOPIA, Manitoba, in fact, as the central hub for all of North America to provide hydrocarbon, carbon dioxide, ammonia, and other natural refrigerant training. And you'll see that on the next slide, please. Refrigerants for Life is what it's called, or refrigerants naturally. So next slide. There's this, I have it only in Spanish, and of course, if you go to the next slide as well, please. I won't explain it's self-explanatory in the way that it works. Refrigerants for Life. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Mark, our internet is a little unstable, so just a second.
No problem.
Sorry, Mark, just a second.
Sure. If it's possible to go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Thank you. So Refrigerants Naturally for Life is the initiative that will go to the next generation of refrigerants for the variety of sectors. And I think that's important. Again, MOPIA Manitoba could help you with integrating that kind of training as well going forward. No question about it, with our partners in Europe. Next slide, please. Okay, these are just some public bulletins that we put together to show industry. I just wanted to give you a sample of it. Again, every person who works on any air conditioning system in our province, whether it be a vehicle or an appliance or air conditioning, must have a certification card issued. And this is a sample of it. Show it, see it, it's the law. And again, outlining the penalties, which are highly significant. And we regulate, as I say, all products that contain refrigerant in our province. And this is a bulletin that shows that as well. Next slide, please. So you might ask the question, how is this funded? How, if the government isn't funding our organization in this initiative and end-of-life stewardship, who is or what is? Well, this kind of outlines it. In our province, each technician that services refrigeration air conditioning equipment has a $25 annual fee. And those fees help fund our initiative, as well as any company in our province that works with regulated products has an annual fee of $50. This is Canadian, so take 20% off US funds to convert it. Beyond that, on the purchase of new refrigerants, there is a levy or a tax, if you wish to call it, of $1.50 per kilogram on new refrigerant. So I believe we had talked about that a little bit in terms of the various approaches. And this is, of course, one of them is where you put a point of purchase, a fee to support the end-of-life stewardship or disposal of, in this case, the refrigerant. That raises millions of dollars, to be frank with you, millions of dollars to help fund the disposal of refrigerants. Again, surplus and contaminated refrigerants, which is so critical. And in our province and other parts of Canada, we're having a stewardship fee of between $25 and $50 on the purchase of new appliances. What I mean by that is fridges, freezers, water coolers, dehumidifiers, and even window air conditioning units. And that fee that is collected at the point of purchase will help support the product stewardship, extended producer responsibility of this, not only the refrigerant, but in fact, even broader. So if you go to the next slide, please. A fridge, this is just a typical refrigerator, and 95...
refrigerador normal, y como un 95%, se me fue la señal.
So 95% of a fridge.
95% del
sorry, Mark.
Mark.
Yes.
Sí.
Pascual, we are hearing you in the English room, the Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So 95% of a refrigerator can in fact be recycled. And so the EPR point of purchase fee, and you can designate it what is, of course, tolerable in your jurisdiction, in your country, in your province, wherever, will help support the recycling of a fridge and freezer. In our province alone, of a population of 1.2 million, we have 60,000 units that are disposed of each year. So that's incredibly significant. And we know that the foam contains, of course, refrigerant. We know that there's potential PCB oils in the compressor. We know that there's other products such as mercury switches that must be properly disposed of. Mercury is, of course, a very potent biohazard, and we're developing or we have an approach where we can make sure that these contaminants stay out of the waste stream and in fact are recycled or repurposed. And so that's very effective. Again, the government doesn't pay for this initiative. It's the point of purchase consumer that pays. Ideally, if we had producers of refrigerators and such in our province, we would probably ask the producers to pay that fee or to contribute to that disposal. But unfortunately, all of the units that come into our province are from other jurisdictions. And I know Pablo from Mabe would know in Mexico, we import a lot of product from there and of course from Asia and other parts of the world. Next slide, please. This gives you just a quick overview of course, the CO2 and the greenhouse impact of a refrigerator. 3 tons is significant. So only 10 years or less in our province, fridges and appliances were disposed of improperly, and they were thrown into waste disposal grounds or dumps, crushed. The refrigerant would be released, and of course, mercury and other contaminants. But this has ultimately stopped and prohibited the release of very harmful products to our environment. Next slide, please. This is an example of an Indigenous community in northern Manitoba. We have about 62 Indigenous First Nation communities, we call them. And unfortunately, a lot of those used fridges don't make it to the proper disposal until now, where we are working with the communities to ensure that these products are, that people on First Nation communities, on Indigenous communities, are trained and can extract the refrigerant and even dismantle, take apart the units for scrap purposes where they get some actual value for the metal and other components. So there's an intrinsic value to doing this. And so this is a significant step forward, and we're very, very delighted about it. Next slide, please. Do you know in parts of Manitoba, people would in fact, I hate to say this and say it publicly here, but they would actually throw appliances into waterways, whether it be rivers, lakes, streams, whatever. And because it's not seen, it's not, it can't be traced and so forth, we knew that this was an improper and very, very bad process. And so we've, again, are working not only with Indigenous communities, but communities throughout our province, towns, cities, to ensure that the refrigerators and other appliances are decommissioned properly. So the next slide will show, next slide, please. This is a refrigerator decommissioning plant in our city, in Winnipeg, a population of 700,000, where the refrigerant is extracted. You can see those several hundred-pound, actually I think they're 500 or 1,000-pound cylinders of refrigerant that are then properly shipped to a disposal site or a recycling plant, and the refrigerant is then, of course, taken out of the environment. Very, very important part. Not only that, but the foam is extracted from all of these units, and we also have a carbon credit system in another province where there's actual financial benefit to Margaret had talked about, of course, carbon credits and that kind of system, that we have that in Canada in parts too, where the dismantler is getting credits and a financial incentive to do that. So that's very positive. Next slide, please. We know again then that many of these white goods or appliances have nasty elements such as mercury in them. We have collection sites throughout Manitoba, throughout our province, and throughout Canada that collect these. You know, I'm not sure in your country, but in other parts of the world, thermostats, mercury, well, first off, I should back up. Mercury is used to put on the light of a fridge or a freezer often. It's a mechanism that helps with that. But you know, there's virtually tens of thousands of mercury switches in these appliances that also need to be recovered. There is no system in, how can I say, in Canada really, that no EPR, so to speak, like we have for tires and for oil and other components. But in this case, the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association and the rack sector came up and said, look, we will pay for this. But it came about only because a regulatory mandate was put in place where it was necessary to do this. So while it is a voluntary program, the mandatory regulatory approach really stirred them to do that. Next slide, please. Automobiles, there is a regulatory approach in our province where it's a mandatory recovery of refrigerant from all cars and vehicles prior to scrapping or to at their end of life. And so the government, in fact, has contracted with various service companies to ensure that all mobile units have their refrigerant recovered. That refrigerant, in turn, is sent for repurposing, for recycling, and or ultimate disposal, which includes incineration. The cost for incineration of refrigerants has typically been about $12 per kilogram, and that can flux, of course, in our crazy market that we have now. But it's costly, and fortunately, it's being done and carried out. Next slide, please. In summary, I know we're a little bit tight for time, but you need to decide if government will fund the ODS management, the EPR system for these regulated products, these highly potent gases and other components. We found that industry will not voluntarily manage the end-of-life ODSs and HFCs without some direction or stimulation, regulation by government. I said it at the last Montreal Protocol meeting, or at least in Rome, that the refrigerant industry has not shown leadership without pressure from government. And you know, you can go back to the introduction of CFCs and of course now HFOs, that in fact they need or they want or they will not act without some form of government direction and certainly regulation, which has frankly worked effectively in our province in Canada and of course other jurisdictions in Europe with the F-gas regulations and other things going forward. Next slide, please. So MOPIA may be able to assist you in reviewing your current program, coordinating and developing a regulatory strategy to show that industry can participate. We can look at, of course, your source and determine efficient logistics for the safe management and end-of-life ODS and HFC stewardship. We are a not-for-profit organization that our real regime is to provide capacity through organizations like UNDP, the World Bank, and others. We want to ensure that the lessons learned that we have, you don't have to make mistakes, that you can jumpstart and go forward on these kinds of things. Next slide, please. Because of time, I'm not going to go into a lot of other details, but I do want to absolutely thank all of those who have participated again on this. And I think the information will be shared, and I know we have to probably go right to questions and answers for the entire group. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing the Canadian experience in managing these ODSs and HFCs. So with this presentation, we've come to an end of the presentations we had scheduled for today. I know we've gone over time, but I believe it's important that we look at the different actions that are being taken in different countries to close the loop the environmental sound management of end-of-life ODSs and HFCs. We do have some questions in the Spanish room. Those questions will be addressed by Nidia. So if you allow us, we're gonna take another 15 minutes to respond to some questions and then close the webinar. So Nidia, can you please ask some of the questions in the Spanish room? Yes, great. I'm going to read some of them. We're going to select some of the questions. We have received several questions, but because of time limitations, we'll be selecting a few. But I should clarify that all the questions that we have received, we will be sharing them with the speakers. Those that we cannot answer here, we will be sending so that they can get a chance to answer in writing, and then all of the answers, as well as the answers to the questions in sessions 1 and 2, will be uploaded onto the website that we have shared with you before, where you can find all the presentations as well. The first question is addressed to Margaret Williams. And the question is as follows. Are offset because of elimination of GHG accredited to the country or a public institution or private institution that carries out the action? Go ahead in the English room.
Thank you. Yes, these are the credits I was speaking about are not credited to a national commitment. They certainly could be if that was part of a country's national program. It is currently it is not part of the United States national program. These credits are applied in California because it is a regulated, because they have a regulation. Certain entities such as power plants or cement manufacturing, any entity that produces a certain amount of emissions is required to reduce their emissions by a certain amount. And they can either reduce their emissions within their own footprint, which they of course are trying to do, but they are allowed to use offsets towards their reduction, towards a portion of their reduction total. So it's not governments, it's regulated entities. In the voluntary market, it's corporations that wish to reduce their emissions voluntarily. That's it. Thank you. Go ahead, Spanish.
Thank you, Margaret, for your answer. Now, next question. Is for Richard, and is as follows. In practical terms, what can we do with the contaminated refrigerant that is disposed by the refrigeration and air conditioning technicians? I guess go ahead.
I guess the short answer is in the second session, we hoped we discussed that. The first step in most countries, and I would underline this absolutely, is to collect, consolidate, and securely store so that you will accumulate enough that can be economically disposed. Globally, there is more than enough capacity in the hazardous waste facilities around the world to do this and do it well. That would involve export for many countries, but to make export economic or even feasible, given the transaction costs associated with local regulations and the Basel Convention, you need to have a critical amount, which various people would argue about what that amount is, but in practical terms in the hazardous waste business, it's a container load. 20 tons to me is a reasonably good number to get a marketable, economically efficient quantity. Where if in a country that has existing infrastructure of some kind, and there's certainly an option is, for example, cement kilns, industrial facilities, destruction can occur in those. It will depend on the purpose, what you want to use any credit you get for destruction, what kind of facility, and the quality of destruction. As Margaret indicated, in the United States, there's specific RCRA requirements related to destruction efficiency. TIAP provides guidelines which are not mandatory unless you're using the amount credited for mandatory reporting and reduction of production, which is a fairly narrow application. The first choice always is recovery and reclaim, at least to the point where you want to eliminate that particular chemical. CFC 12, as an example, would now have to be destroyed globally anywhere. There shouldn't be a market for CFC 12. That point will come within the next decade for HCFCs. And hopefully ultimately for HFCs. Again, I would refer you to some of the presentations in the second section that gives more information. And if you want more details, feel free to send me an email. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, for your answer. Now, here's another question for Pablo Moreno. And the question is, what has been MAVA's influence in the rack sector so that other manufacturers or importers may adopt and participate in this scheme that you call PER, Producers Extended Responsibility? It's here in the Spanish room. Go ahead, Pablo. Well, thank you for the question. Our presence regionally has facilitated the chance that we can participate widely in all the negotiations that we referred to during the presentation, but also it's important to mention that through our program, we have identified a great deal of the trends that are turning to reality. We saw that early in advance, as we could see with the all the work we have done with you in Colombia. It's been several years in this mission, and we've been able to build capacities at MAVE and have trained personnel, and then we have been leaders throughout the region in this PR program. Also to replace 134 by our 600, just to give an example. We are the first manufacturers in Latin America that have replaced or have changed their equipment manufactured with our 600, and a great deal of this effort is because of the support that we have received from the Montreal Protocol and other organizations. So from that perspective, I mean, energy efficiency perspective, we've also worked very hard in adopting standards, very strict standards today we have in Mexico. The last regulation passed internationally. And as you know, energy efficiency works there to achieve the energy efficiency levels, incorporation of refrigerant gases. That's R600 that contributes to that. So here we, let's say, close the loop. On the one hand, we have an energy efficiency. On the other hand, the refrigerant gases. And then on the other hand, the producer's extended responsibility. That's where we are driving this influence or this momentum in the region to look or to seek not only the replacement of equipment under these premises, and together with the capacity building we have achieved big influence. So the competition is more efficient because we are, let's say, shoulder to shoulder. We have incorporated or included other gases, and now we're working very strongly with the guilds and to take advantage of their leadership and to motivate them to incorporate them into the PR program that we have discussed. So we have played an important role, and this hope that will continue an important role. It's a big responsibility, by the way, but the industry is convinced, based on what we have seen, to continue to follow that road. That's where we are. Thank you. Thank you, Paulo, for your answer. We just have two more questions. Next one is for Sweli and Vital. The question is as follows. What were the challenges to implement the Buyers Club? Go ahead in the English room with your answer.
Thank you. I think we're going to still have to deal with many other challenges, but because we are initiating this concept of using Buyers Club to make a collection of ODS and HFCs something that is of interest in large quantities and economically viable. That said, the initial challenge was to get into the education of the procurement departments of big corporations, like to get into a big bank or a large hospital or a big retail store, and to say that you wanted to look at or work with them on their procurement practices and criteria. This is something that takes a long time because it needs confidence. They need to understand. So education is I'm so sorry. Because education is needed first. And then I'll pass the floor to my colleague, because he was the one we looked for partnership working with the hospitals, and maybe he's the better person to talk about challenges in that sector. Vital.
Thanks, Sweli. I think talking specifically about healthcare, probably one of the main challenges will be that Brazilian healthcare organizations are not used to buy in a kind of a group purchasing system. So the health system is very fragmented, and we are observing a consolidation of hospitals in big group. So probably in the short term, we will have more interest on group procurement. And this is an opportunity because by recognizing the potential of buying together, I think healthcare organization will have interest on all the benefits, not only by implementing new technology and innovation on environmental aspects, but also in financial and other gains by buying in a group process. So I'm
Thank
finished.
you. Thank you for your answer. And we have one final question. I'm going to bring two questions together. They are for Mark Miller. The first one is, has Mopia started any cooperation programs with other countries to transfer their experience? And the second question that's got to do with something similar is also for Mark. Knowing that sellers need to receive the disposable containers of refrigerants, do you have any policy in place? I mean, do sellers, do they have any choice to commercialize containers with, I mean, the container, but with new refrigerant? And is it the same cost, or is it a different cost if they use a disposed and recycled container? Go ahead in the English room.
Thank you very much for the questions. And so I'll answer those as quickly as I can, because again, I know we're under the time. MOPIA is in fact in discussion with UNDP, the World Bank, and other organizations to provide capacity in other countries. We have for China under their HALON program. That was a significant step forward for China to decommission and to regulate and to move away from halons in their system. So in fact, we have done that. We're in discussion with Egypt and some other nations as we speak, even the Gambia, to have some training initiatives take place there. And we are in discussion with, of course, UNEP to potentially do some projects in Central and Latin America as well. And we'd reach out to do that. In terms of the second question, sellers, of course, they're not it's a significant cost for them to receive back this refrigerant, but that $1.50 point of purchase fee is then provided to them to ensure that there are no actual physical costs to them. While they do take on the costs of storing the refrigerant, the surplus and contaminated refrigerants, they're reimbursed for that. And as Rick mentioned just previously, the key to it is to ensure that there's surplus or adequate quantities to ship that contaminated refrigerant for ultimate disposal. So the economies of scale will allow you to do that and to do it efficiently, the most efficient way possible. So there's a central storage facility that we also use in our province that is sent to Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And then the product is either shipped to a kiln or incinerator in Chicago or Texas. And it seems to be the most economical and viable way to do it. But again, as mentioned by Rick, you have to have adequate quantities to make sure that that's efficient. I hope that answers the questions, and thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll be sending the questions to the lecturers so that they can probably add on to the answers they've given, or they can answer other questions that were not answered, and we'll keep all the memoirs. So, Andres, go ahead and close the seminar. Thank you. Thank you, Nidia. It's been 3 occasions, very interesting webinars, and we have learned what is being done for the environmentally sound management of end-of-life ODSs and HFCs. We apologize because we went over time today. We hope it'll worth it. We heard about several examples throughout the region about what is being done, different approximations. To close, I want to thank the United Nations Environmental Protection Agency for their financial support for these talks. We hope that this will be the starting point for many initiatives and projects. We also want to thank the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development and its National Ozone Unit, Nidia, Andres, Lady, everyone, the support and the contribution to make this webinar possible. We want to thank Pascual, the interpreter, for his patience and the different sessions that we had to have. And I don't want to close without thanking our main consultant, Rick Cook, for his dedication, technical support in preparing the agenda, the probably suggestions for speakers, and for the whole webinar. Of course, all the speakers, everyone who shared their knowledge and experiences to help this idea of closing the loop, the environmental sound management of NDA of end of life ODSs and HFCs. Our colleagues also, UNDP, Karina, and others. And finally, I want to thank everyone, all the participants and attendees for joining us throughout these 3 sessions. And thank you for showing interest for this environmental sound management of ODSs and HFCs so that we can close the loop. We hope that you can join us in future events that we'll be hosting from UNDP, topics related to the Montreal Protocol and other related topics. Managing plastics and other contaminants, persistent pollutants. We hope to see you soon in another webinar. Thank you very much and see you next time. Goodbye. Oh, one more thing. Remember that the recordings and the presentations will be found in the website or this event, the seminar website. You'll be able to find all the information there, all the presentations and everything. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.